Thanks everybody for saddling up with me, coming back for another short ride with the stud. This one is going to be a very unusual one. This shows you the, the different things that we have on the streaming channel that you're not going to find anywhere else. I've got my book, Brutus, the audio version of that. We've already had one of those on before. And then I'm writing another book. It's called The Real History of American Professional Wrestling. And we're going to have a little piece of one of those today. And this series, we have a series of shows that are actually chapters from the book. And this one is Superstars of the Sport. That's what the and the superstars of the past, they're all past wrestlers. I started back with Abraham Lincoln, of all people, as one of the great wrestlers of all time. And he truly was. But this one we're going to do, it's episode 4. It has to do with the greatest wrestlers of the between 1910 and 1920. It's a very difficult time frame. After doing lots of research on this book before I even started writing any of it, I realized that that's a decade in which it was very difficult to pick one particular wrestler. But there's 2 wrestlers that I call the stars of the decade. And there's 2 of them in this one. And oddly enough, one of them trained my grandfather to wrestle. So we're gonna take a little ride here. This one is going to be a little longer than usual, but about 7 minutes, a little over 7 minutes or so. But we're going to introduce you to a little bit of my grandfather and 2 of the guys that are going to become the superstars of the past. That's what they were, and they're going to in the real history of American professional wrestling, the book that I'm writing. So let's take a little look and see what was going on between 1910 and 1920.
However, it was his humanitarian gifts that he became legendary for, the biggest of which was the nation's first boys' ranch, founded in 1939. Kids Incorporated in 1945 was also founded by him, which today serves 15,000 participants annually in 50-plus sports programs. And Girlstown, USA in 1949 was his creation as well. All his numerous programs were faith-based. His boys' ranch for young boys with no fathers became so popular that young fatherless boys from all over America were being sent to Amarillo for a chance at a better life. It became so famous, Hollywood's Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer studio produced a movie called Boys Ranch in its honor. He and his wife Mimi from Amarillo sold their assets 30 years before his death to be able to continue their contributions to all he was involved with. He was honored by many worldwide. World boxing champ Jack Dempsey, J. Edgar Hoover, and Roy Rogers were among his staunchest friends and supporters. Dorrance Dory Funk, citizen of Amarillo and father of the only 2 brothers in wrestling history to both be NWA world champions, served on Cal Farley's staff. Cal Farley also affected other wrestlers. Eddie Graham, one of the owners of the Florida Territory and good friends with Dory Funk, visited Dory and was introduced to Cal Farley, and also visited Cal's Boys Ranch. He came home to Florida and established the Florida's Boys Ranch, which is still operating in Florida. In 1989, Amarillo's Civic Coliseum was renamed the Cal Farley Coliseum. In 1996, the United States Postal Service honored Cal with a Great American Series 32-cent postage stamp. His professional wrestling accomplishments were many, but nothing compared to what he did for others. On February 19, 1967, Cal Farley took a seat in the back pew of the Boys Ranch Chapel, greeted a boy seated in front of him, sat back, and as the congregation sang, "Glorious is thy name," closed his eyes and died. 33 days later, the love of his life, his wife Mimi, died. Now let's have a look at the second superstar of the past. in the 1910 to 1920 decade. The original Dutch Mantell, Alfred Albert Job de Rela Gedern, was born in Dykirk, Luxembourg on July 21, 1881. South America and one to England later, he landed on American soil at 19 years of age in 1900. He focused on his wrestling ability and became a professional. He was not a handsome man, but intelligent enough to use that fact to build his reputation as maybe the first true wrestling villain in the sport. Funny thing about our next superstar of the decade is that he and our first superstar of the decade, Cal Farley, had a great deal in common and would become best friends, actually meeting each other under very odd circumstances. Cal Farley was in the middle of winning 225 straight matches in 1919 when matches were still legitimate. He would become the world welterweight wrestling champion at 145 pounds in 1920. In 1921, he was wrestling in El Paso, Texas, against one of the best Japanese wrestlers in the world, Matti Matsuda. Cal Farley had won the match when an unknown and uninvited wrestler stepped into the ring amid jeering fans and flying bottles to challenge the winner. It was Cal Farley's first sight of one of the meanest looking men on earth, Dutch Mantell. Mantell had already beaten former world lightweight champion Matsuda that Farley had just whipped, as well as welterweight champion Jack Reynolds and many other top wrestlers. Farley accepted the challenge. The following is his description of that match, plus the last one the two of them ever had in Amarillo. Here was Farley's comments. Both ended in ugly brawls, with a cracked skull for the Dutchman and enough free-flowing blood from the both of us to establish the sport solidly in the city's favor. After the second meeting, we agreed it was better to be friends. Roy had been training with him for more than 2 years. Dutch had already set Roy up to go to Columbus, Ohio, and start wrestling professionally in one of the first wrestling territories in the history of the sport. Right before Roy left, Dutch asked him to go with him to Houston, Texas, and watch his back. Dutch had been hired by one of the two Houston wrestling promoters that were competing with each other over wrestling rights to the city. The promoters made a deal that each would get their best shooter, put them against each other, split the gate, and the promoters whose shooter won would own Houston from then on. Obviously, one of the promoters chose Dutch to be his shooter. Dutch was wealthy enough to have one of the first Ford cars ever made. Even with the car, it took 3 days for him and Roy to get to Houston from Amarillo. Some parts of the state had no highways in the early 1920s, and they had to drive through private ranches in some places and sleep in pastures. When Dutch left the dressing room for the shoot with the other wrestler, Roy followed behind Dutch to make sure no one attacked him from behind. The match was very short. I tell the rest of this story only to show the mentality and dangers of shooters back in those days. Roy was expecting Dutch to go after his opponent with wrestling moves, but they pushed each other into the ropes a couple of times with clean breaks. The third time, Dutch's opponent threw a punch. Dutch's early training in boxing in Australia became the difference. Dutch ducked and hit the wrestler under his right eye. The punch was so hard it broke the orbital bone below the eye that holds the eye in its socket. The wrestler's eye fell out of his head and dangled on the optical cord connected to the back of the eye. He got sick instantly, falling to his knees, because he had one eye seeing his opponent and the other seeing the mat below. His equilibrium was destroyed. The match was stopped, Dutch's hand was raised, and his opponent was held back to his dressing room. When they left the ring, Dutch told Roy to follow him to the other wrestler's dressing room. Dutch entered as Roy followed and went to the other wrestler, sitting in a chair with a towel pressed over his injured eye. The wrestler jerked backward, not expecting Dutch to come to his dressing room. Dutch looked down at him and said, "It's a good thing you quit, 'cause I was already looking at that other eye." I'm going to finish the Superstars of the Past episode with something I doubt many people would believe after hearing this story and seeing how Dutch Mantell looked. He was definitely mean in the ring, but outside the ring rarely seen without his Bible. He had a reputation as a soft touch and gave away most of his earnings. His honesty and concern for those less fortunate were legendary. Because of his big heart, and liberal giving habits, his friends had to take over his finances completely to keep him from giving it all away and becoming a pauper before his death. Dutch Mantell died on January 31st, 1941. In his will, his remaining finances were split between the Maverick Club and the Boys Ranch, established by his friend Cal Farley, both organizations that Dutch had helped build and ardently supported.
Geez, I hope you enjoyed that. Wow, it's got a lot of stuff in that, a lot of information in it. Obviously, it's not the whole chapter, but it's a portion of the chapter. And my grandfather, Roy Welch, was trained by one of those guys, Dutch Mantell, the original Dutch Mantell. Actually, in the chapter that you have on the ClassicContinentalWrestling.com streaming channel, you're going to be able to hear a little bit about the new Dutch Mantell. He's in that chapter too. So just really appreciate everybody joining me for these. Hope you're enjoying them. Hope you're going to come back and watch some more of them. Don't forget that this is a short ride, and the long ride is on ClassicContinentalWrestling.com. And Jesus, all kinds of stories there, all kinds of different things other than just wrestling TV shows and wrestling matches. There's my book. There's this book that we just got a piece of. There's documentaries. It just goes on and on. Just want to make everybody kind of aware of what's going on over there. It's $4.99 a month, or $39.99 a year. And hope you come back and join us again. We're going to bring you another one.